Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another forecast discussion. Sorry if you can hear some background noise. I'm sharing a room with my chase partner here, and we're getting ready for a potentially significant severe weather event today. We've been talking about this for a few days now. Moderate risk is out for parts of far northeast Louisiana into much of central and northern Mississippi, including places like Delhi, Louisiana, Jackson, up the I-55 corridor there into north central Mississippi. Enhanced risk does surround that goes all the way down to the Texas-Louisiana border and up into the Memphis, Tennessee area with a slight and marginal risk around that. Significant tornadoes are going to be the main threat for today. You can see the 15 hatched area right there across that moderate risk zone with a 10% hatched area. In both areas, significant, possibly long track violent tornadoes are a possibility for today. Damaging winds also going to be a much lesser threat, but the threat is still there for damaging winds and some large hail, especially with initial supercells out in the western and central portions of the outlook area. So let's go ahead and dive right in here for today. This is our water vapor satellite imagery, and you can see our little trough here that is going to be the main player for today's severe weather event. You can see that little kind of kink in that moisture gradient right there. That is our trough digging down into the central portion of the country. You can see kind of broad southwesterly flow rounding the base of that trough. And if we go down to our here into the Arkansas region, you can see some storms already starting to fire in kind of a warm advection regime to the north of the main front. Let's look at our radar here real quick. I'll kind of pause it right here. You can see some of these kind of just scattered thunderstorms here ongoing across central and southeast Arkansas. Those are going to move off quickly toward the northeast, and those will not be an issue for today. Those are well to the north of the best ingredients right now, as the moisture is still kind of making its way up from the Gulf. We'll talk about that in a second. We do see some blips kind of firing up here in far southeast Texas into parts of Louisiana. Those will have to be watched through the morning hours as that front does lift northward. Some of them might be able to interact with the warm sector as it moves northward, and those may have a severe threat later on. But for now, the radar remains fairly quiet across the region. Not much to speak of yet. Recording this at about 8 a.m. Central Standard Time here, so this is still very early in the day. We do have some blips firing up here in the southeast Texas and Louisiana vicinity. Let's go to our visible satellite, take a look at what's going on here. I'll pause this as well. You can see pretty clear across much of Mississippi and Alabama. Some low clouds entrenched here from basically central Arkansas southward through east Texas and much of Louisiana and southern Mississippi. That, I do believe, will kind of move northward today as that best moisture that these clouds kind of indicate moves northward as well. Although we should see some breaks in the clouds maintain. You can see some breaks here, southern Louisiana, northeast Louisiana, that we should see enough breaks to get some surface heating today to kind of couple with the very strong warm moist advection there at the surface to help destabilize the atmosphere over the coming hours. Let's look at our upper air maps here, 500 millibars, and a very, very broad trough here, pretty much taking up the entire United States with kind of two sort of bulbs of flow here. You can see the main sort of band of enhanced winds here around the base of the trough. And you can see this little band here across the kind of, northeast Texas to Arkansas vicinity. We talked about this in our forecast video a couple of days ago. This is going to be kind of a sort of dual jet structure here, if you will. This northern one is the main trough. It's kind of what the polar jet. And this one down here is called the subtropical jet. These two are going to kind of merge today. And across the target area today, we'll have this kind of subtropical jet just hanging out, this slightly enhanced band of flow here emanating from farther south here. And that will be our sort of upper air support for storm initiation later on today. And again, we've talked about this. When you have just broad southwesterly flow with subtle forcing, either a kind of, subtle short waves moving through a loft or sort of subtle surface boundaries, convective rolls at the surface, the forcing is going to be very subtle, and therefore discrete storms are more likely. And that thinking has not changed here over the past couple of days. So we'll go into storm mode a little bit more later on here. But right away, this kind of checks my box for southeast type tornado events. Is when you just kind of have broad southwesterly or west southwesterly flow across the area with subtle forcing. It's usually a recipe, given the intense parameter spaces you can see out here in the southeast, for significant tornado events from discrete supercells. Let's go to 850 millibars. Let's take a look at our low-level jet, and you can see we have a very broad low-level jet here, stretching all the way into Texas, from areas from Texas out toward the east and northeast there. The main axis is kind of from Missouri down to Arkansas. In areas farther south, we have 40, 45, 50 plus knots of flow there, and that should kind of maintain itself and shift off toward the east later on today and provide a very favorable environment to, number one, pump that moisture northward, pump the kind of profiles we're seeing out here over the Gulf northward, and also enhance the low-level shear profiles for today, given surface winds kind of out of the south. Very strong low-level shear should develop given that low-level jet in place. Let's go down to the surface here and take a look at what we're seeing. So, pretty interesting surface pattern right here. We have a very deep low here across northeast Kansas. That is going to continue to move off toward the northeast today. And as it does so, the flow here in the low levels across the southeast will back out of the southwest to south here across the target area. And that is going to pull all of this moisture and this warm sector northward, and we're going to be able to maintain a very broad warm sector with very moist air in the low levels here for several hours. This is going to be a long duration event. Storms will likely start in the morning hours, late morning hours, and go on well into the evening, into the overnight hours across the region, because this warm sector, as the surface low moves off toward the northeast at a good pace, it will just kind of keep pulling that moisture northward in kind of a broad area. So we'll have a very wide warm sector with a very impressive parameter space over that warm sector for a very long period of time. So there should be multiple rounds of storms within the warm sector today. Let's go ahead and look at our surface data here. This is our latest surface map. So let's kind of point out where the best moisture is right now. Pretty much far southern Mississippi into kind of central Louisiana here, and making its way into East Texas. The mid to upper 60s and 70s dew points are relegated below to the south of that line right now, but as we said, that is going to push its way northward today as that surface low moves off toward the northeast. We'll continue to get that strengthening of the flow in the low levels to pull that moisture northward, and this is going to be kind of what we call just-in-time moisture. The moisture will be making its way northward throughout the day. So areas in kind of the moderate risk area will not really be in favorable moisture until maybe late morning to early afternoon at the earliest, when that kind of marine warm front, if you will make its way into the area and continue to move northward into the evening hours, and then we should see the entire region primed with that juicy low-level air. Winds already out of the south-southeast here, fairly backed winds in the warm sector, fairly modest strength of the surface winds. I do expect those to strengthen somewhat throughout the day, given this strong mass response from that surface low as it moves off toward the northeast here. But again, broad warm sector. You can see the 70s, upper 60s dew points extend all the way here into central Texas, kind of off the screen. And again, they go kind of all the way out toward the southern portions of Mississippi and Alabama. So a very wide warm sector that we have going on, and that will maintain itself throughout the day. And once again, a very wide warm sector with a very impressive parameter space over that warm sector for a long period of time is going to mean that the conditions will be favorable for significant severe weather for a long period of time for these areas. All right, let's take a look at some soundings here. I want to start back here in far south Texas. This is the morning Brownsville sounding. Couple things we see: moisture here at the surface, 74 over 72, so we're firmly in the warm sector there at Brownsville. Moist layer goes up to about 850 millibars. And then we have a very stout elevated mixed layer here. Once again, that EML is that layer of warm, dry air and steep lapse rates that emanates from the Mexican Plateau and the desert southwest and gets advected across the target area by that kind of southwesterly mid-level flow. And that is going to be the case here. Now, remember, if we recall our low-level jet here out at the 850 millibars, notice the wind barbs here. I'll kind of zoom in. They are out of the southwest right now. And what is to the southwest of our target area today? Well, it's South Texas and that part of the Gulf. So this elevated mix layer is likely to continue to advect into the region, given the southwesterly and westerly, sort of southwesterly mid-level flow. This elevated mix layer will continue to make its way into the region, and that will likely suppress convection, at least robust convection, for much of the morning hours into the early afternoon. So that is another check mark that I like to use when I'm forecasting for the southeast. Do we have an elevated mix layer in place? And it looks like we will, as that 850 millibar, that low-level jet, continues to push this EML into the region. That should hold things off through much of the late morning and early afternoon hours, at least robust convection. I do expect we will get more showers to develop out here as that front moves, as that warm sector moves northward. We should get an increase in the coverage of some just spotty showers here throughout the morning and late morning hours before things really start to ramp up in the early afternoon across Louisiana into southwest Mississippi. Let's see what we got going on here over the region right now. This is Lake Charles, the 12Z sounding here. And at Lake Charles, you can see very deep moist layer extending all the way up to about 750 millibars or so. Not much of an elevated mix layer to speak of right now over Lake Charles, but again, that should advect in a little bit throughout the late morning hours. We're already destabilized quite a bit here at Lake Charles, over 1,200 joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE, with already long photographs with favorable curvature there in the low levels, almost 300 meters squared per second squared effective storm relative helicity there in this photograph already, and that should only increase as the day goes on, given the strengthening of that low-level jet and as that low-level jet translates east. Let's look here at Jackson. This is going to be north of the front, so north of the best moisture right now. You can see at the surface 55 over 51. We do have a little bit of maybe some sort of EML already in place over the region here. You can see slightly steeper lapse rates there, some drier air aloft there between 700 and 850 millibars. So once again, that elevated mix layer should hold things off for much of the morning and early into the early afternoon before things really ramp up. Jackson, same thing as far as the wind profile goes. Very stout curvature there in the low levels, and 0 to 1 kilometer storm relative helicity of 687 right now. That means we have extreme warm advection ongoing. That's the pulling of that warm, moist air from the south to the north at a very efficient pace, given these numbers here. But this profile, again, will only increase as the day goes on and will be favorable for supercells, some tornadic, as we go into the afternoon hours. Let's look at some model data now. We've done our observed data. This is the 12Z NAM that's rolling in right now. You can see that kind of dual jet structure there, that enhanced band of flow around the base of the trough with our subtropical jet down there. Once again, we talked about December 10th, 2021, the quad state tornadic event from last year. Looks almost identical to that, at least at 500 millibars with our kind of dual jet structure here. Just broad southwesterly flow across the region. Again, that means forcing for ascent will be extremely subtle instead of a big sort of deep trough with more sort of meridional flow there, where your forcing would be really, really strong and the overall storm mode would be messier. Not going to be the case today, I fear, which will only increase the significant tornado threat. Let's go down to 850 millibars, see how the low-level jet progresses today. You can see that where that low-level cyclone is, and just a very broad swath of 40 to 50 to 60 knots of flow extending all the way up into the Great Lakes region down into East Texas. So as the warm sector moves northward across East Texas and Louisiana late this morning into the early afternoon hours, that's where the storms are going to intensify first, given strong wind profiles here and an increasingly favorable low-level moisture profile for supercells, surface-based supercells. We will first see the storms start to intensify there across far East Texas into Louisiana before they move off into the kind of best environment here across Mississippi, kind of that's western to central to north-central Mississippi corridor. Surface plot here. This is our surface. We can see where our surface low is, initialized there in northeast Kansas. Once again, that's going to move off toward the northeast over the coming hours, and you can see those reds and oranges. That's that warm air aloft, bringing that juicy air with it, that surface low, as it moves off toward the northeast. So our warm sector going to be very, very broad across the region. And here is our dew point plot. I mean, that is almost that's pretty textbook as far as a southeast tornado outbreak goes when you have this broad of a warm sector. And once again, we like to look for these little prefrontal troughs and any little subtle forcing mechanisms in the open warm sector that may help focus storm initiation later on. So let's zoom in here and see what we can see. This is at 18Z right here. So first thing I notice here is a little kink right there across central Mississippi into northwest Mississippi there. That may be some sort of, that may be the warm front actually. Let's take a look. Actually, the NAM has it a little bit farther south, so it looks like this actually might be the warm front down in here across central Louisiana. I'm not 100% sold on the NAM solutions here over the past couple of days. They are a little bit slower with the progression of that warm sector than some of the other models. If we look at our kind of 60s to 70s dew point line here, it's only in far southern Mississippi by 18Z, or about 1 p.m. And some of the other models were showing it kind of farther up here into central Mississippi. So we'll just have to kind of watch how that moisture return goes into the afternoon hours today. This is at 21Z, and you can see it does rapidly advect northward. So by 21Z, the entire area, that moderate risk area, should be in the juiciest air mass as those showers out of Louisiana start to move in. So it shouldn't be too much of an issue. I think we should see storms start to intensify probably just after lunchtime across Louisiana as they move into Mississippi. As we go towards sunset, that's when the parameters should be most favorable for severe weather, between that kind of 21 to 0Z time frame here, which is about 3 to 6 p.m. This evening. Let's take a few soundings. We'll go start at 21Z here, right kind of along the warm front in western Mississippi there, and we'll go back a little bit to the southwest in kind of east central Louisiana. And you can see here, very favorable looking profile for severe storms. Very large looping hodographs there, almost 400 meters squared per second squared of effective SRH, with a very lengthy hodograph there, almost 60 knots of effective bulk shear. So supercells are going to be likely here, and once again, given that subtle forcing in the warm sector, we should be seeing a more discrete mode of storm organization. Instability is, at first glance might seem a little bit meager, only just over 1,000 joules per kilogram of CAPE, but when you have this strong of a kinematic profile, it doesn't take much instability to spark some severe convection. My only caveat with this event is the low-level lapse rates here, and the NAM has been a little bit more bearish as far as low-level lapse rates and low-level instability goes. You can see the steepness sort of that temperature profile there. It's almost vertical there for just kind of a basic definition. 0 to 3 kilometer lapse rates only at 5.3 degrees Celsius per kilometer here. And that is not super favorable for really getting those updrafts to accelerate upward on their own. We want to see that temperature profile a little bit more steeply sloped there. That would mean the lapse rates, or the change in temperature with height, is a lot more rapid, and that would lead to more efficient acceleration upward in the vertical of those parcels near the surface. Not seeing that on the NAM. Some of the other models were a little bit better, and that is often something that we do see in these southeast setups. I think anywhere that we get breaks in the clouds and any sort of differential heating boundaries may assist that and bump those up a little bit. And oftentimes these weak low-level lapse rates don't really matter, given the very strong kinematics here in the southeast especially. So not something that is too worrisome as far as a tornado threat goes, or at least negating the tornado threat, which obviously is not a good thing in these setups, but something to note nonetheless. This is farther back into Louisiana. You can see the instability is a little bit greater here, almost just over 1,700 joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE here. Low levels are a little bit better thermodynamically here. The low-level lapse rates are approaching 6, still on the weak side. We want to get those kind of at above 6 degrees Celsius per kilometer as much as we can. Profiles very favorable for tornadic supercells. Low-level curvature very strong with long hodographs. Favorable for supercells that will be able to take advantage of this very strong storm relative helicity in the low levels. So that's kind of the early mode here, and then we'll go to 0Z as that warm sector continues to advect northward. We'll take some soundings here, one in northwest Mississippi, and it gets even better there. You can see instability has increased a little bit and the low-level thermos still a little bit on the weak side. There, but mid-level lapse rates very, very steep. So that would be favorable for the maintenance of any supercells in this parameter space. Look at that photograph there. Very strong curvature in the low levels, giving a strengthening of that low-level jet with time. So any supercells that are ongoing, and the NAM is actually showing a little bit more backed surface winds out of the south-southeast. South-southeast, some of the models were showing just kind of southerly or almost south-southwesterly surface winds across the warm sector. And the NAM here showing a little bit more backed flow, which only increases the wind shear profile in the low levels, which will be favorable for significant tornadic supercells in this parameter space. So overnight, again, that broad sector, warm sector maintains itself into the late evening hours, and then finally that cold front starts to push through and shove that warm sector off into areas to the east and into the Gulf. So, but a very long duration event. You can see that warm sector sets up starting by about 15 to 18 Z and maintains itself for several hours. So once again, a long duration, significant severe weather threat, given the very strong kinematics in place. Finally, we'll take a look at the cams here. The other cams are not quite out yet, I don't believe, so we'll look at just the 12Z HER here. Once again, take this with a grain of salt. Often doesn't handle these kind of warm advection, sort of warm sector supercell events very well. But we get an increase, general increase in showery sort of activity across the warm sector, just kind of around lunchtime here. And then things start to intensify just after lunch, basically noon to 1 p.m. You start to see some increase in those reflectivity cores and just little isolated, more discrete supercells here, moving it from Louisiana into west central Mississippi. And then late in the day, we get some updraft helicity streaks there as storms intensify. And these would, of course, have a significant tornado threat, very discrete looking storms all the way back into western Louisiana. Just kind of a train of these storms, and that's a very foreboding look from this convective allowing model, as these storms are discrete and would have the potential for significant tornadoes, some long track, and potentially violent tornadoes. And then as the forcing kind of increases after dark, the low level jet ramps up after dark. That may allow storms to be a little bit messier with time, but you can see we have multiple rounds of supercells as that warm sector stays broad before that cold front shoves it off toward the southeast. So that's going to wrap things up for this morning. Once again, the forecast thinking hasn't changed much from the last couple of days. Moderate risk out for parts of far northeast Louisiana into central and north central Mississippi. Enhanced risk area surrounding that. That moderate risk will have the greatest potential for significant tornadoes, and that includes places like Jackson, Mississippi, and the I-55 corridor off toward the north, and then goes all the way to the Mississippi-Alabama border. So places like Columbus, Starkville, Louisville are in the biggest threat area as well. Damaging winds, a threat, not going to be the greatest threat until maybe storms congeal into a more messy organization later on this evening. Large hail will be a threat given the moderate instability and strong deep layer shear, especially with initial convection over the western and central portions of the outlook area. So with that, thanks for watching. We will see you in the next video.